work spying on all of you. It's not enough to believe in something. It's not enough to believe, yes, this person did a good thing. We have to ultimately stand for something if we want to protect the rights that we ourselves inherited. Because rights, liberties, a free society, these aren't things that can be taken for granted. Maintaining these gifts from prior generations, from our history, requires a constant gardening. And it concerns me that the rhetoric that we see for those who speak out against whistleblowers today like to say from one side of their mouth, yes, they did a good thing. We applaud them. That's wonderful. And at the same time, they go, oh, well, it would be problematic if we welcome them to Europe. Welcoming and protecting whistleblowers is not a hostile act. That is the act of a friend. It is a hand extended to a partner who is stumbling. It is not an attempt to retaliate against a government who you are upset with, but rather an attempt to return them to the values that they claim to have been representing for years. This is very similar, not to go too off track here, but we see, of course, on the internet, the many abuses that we've seen of digital systems, people who constantly talk about the worst things that are done. Terrorist propaganda, hate speech, toxicity, and personal abuse and harassment. And they go, oh, well, the way we fix this is we disconnect these people from the internet. We remove them from the platform. We remove their right to speak. But the best response to the worst person is not silence. It is not to take away their tongue. It is not to meet anger with anger, but rather to point out where they are wrong, to drag them out onto the stage, to discredit the heinous ideas, and show everyone who's watching, the ones who otherwise might be persuaded that this bad speech is an attractive thing, the better way. We need to make bad people, and we need to make bad governments better. And the way we do that is by living and voicing our values to the best of our ability, even when our peers who say they share those values aren't living up to them. We don't abandon them, we rescue them.
One of the stunning moments when you read your book is how much you were a conservative patriot some 15 years ago, and you even supported the Iraq War. You obviously believed in the war on terror and everything that happened after 9/11, huh?
The greatest regret of my life is how easily I was transformed into a tool of factions in my country's government. Not even the government itself, but factions within my country's government who were pursuing this neoconservative and then neoliberal strategy to dominate the world. And I did this quite unskeptically because I grew up in a culture and in a family that believed the United States government was the greatest force for good in the history of the world. Now, some of you guys might laugh about that, but think about all the movies that you've seen come out of Hollywood, and think about that just being the background noise. Think about having your father work for this government, your mother work for this government, your grandparents work for this government, and realizing that inevitably you would end up working for this government too. That lack of skepticism was for the better part of a decade fatal to my values, because I denied my own youthful beliefs and subordinated those to the directives of my government, of this large institution that we're all supposed to trust. We're supposed to be able to trust the government. And so when I see the Secretary of Defense of the United States, the President of the United States, coming forward, and they're on TV, and I'm quite young and politically inexperienced, and they say this is a dictator. They've developed weapons of mass destruction. They're holding the world at ransom. They're exploiting their people, and we are going there to save the world, really, and to free the oppressed. I said, I want to do my part to help. It took me a very, very, very long time to realize that all those people who had been protesting for so many years had a point. It is not enough to trust institutions. And in fact, although it is beneficial to be able to trust the government, in a free country, you're not supposed to trust a government. The government is always supposed to be fighting a losing battle to persuade the people of a free society that the authority that they seek, that the spending they desire, that the policy that they like is necessary. And they should win just by the skin of their teeth, by the tiniest margin, convince us to agree with them. Because then we have a government that only does what it must. Then we have a government that does what is necessary to protect the common welfare, right? Instead of doing everything that it can, which is a far greater measure. And that is where you get the excesses of the last decades. What happened in the United States, the original sin, the fatal flaw, is in a moment of national trauma. We had very sophisticated officials, then Vice President Dick Cheney in the White House, who knew where all the levers of power were in government. And they brushed off the dust from a law that had already been written years prior, the Patriot Act, that really unchained every imaginable power from government, even though we didn't realize it at the time. And even though the government swore that's not what it did. In fact, secretly, they argued, and they argued before secret courts, that now there were no more rules. And this is how we went from that country of my childhood, which perhaps never existed, but I believed that it did, to one that tortured, to one that engaged in extrajudicial killings, right? And they restructured our language. They no longer said things like assassination. They said targeted killing. They no longer said prisoners. They said detainees. They no longer said torture. They said enhanced interrogation. And this is what led us to the world of today, where in so many countries, whether it's the United States, the United Kingdom, France, or even Germany, these governments no longer say mass surveillance. They say bulk collection. But these things are the same.
Ed, before you joined the NSA, you were working with the CIA. In the book, you describe the first day when you arrived in Langley. How was it?
I was so proud. You have to remember that I didn't graduate formally from high school. I got sick, and because of that, I would have been held behind. So I went, oh, who needs high school? And I joined a community college. But I didn't graduate from there, even though I studied for a while. Instead, I took a test, which is an equivalency of a high school degree under US laws. And I was so shocked that I could get rid of 2 years of schooling that I owed to the state in 2 days of taking a test. And I passed, and it was great. And then suddenly I got from this guy who started with nothing, no credentials, nothing besides some technical skills, and now I'm entering on to duty, as they call it, at the CIA headquarters, right? That's from all of those movies. And I'm standing in front of the flag in a dark room with many people like me, all far more qualified, all more experienced. And we raise our right hands, and one by one, we swear an oath. And this is a common misunderstanding. People say I violated my oath because it was an oath of secrecy. But there is no oath of secrecy. It does not exist. There is a secrecy agreement, but this is a civil contract with the government, a non-disclosure agreement, very romantically called Standard Form 312. On the other hand, we do have a very dramatic oath of service. And this is what I did on that first day. I swore allegiance, an oath of loyalty, not to the CIA, not to the intelligence community, not even to the government of the United States. But it says, I swear to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, our basic law, against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And so this was really the scene that set the stage for what would become the biggest conflict of my life. What do you do when you do truly have an agreement to secrecy? You've told the government you're not going to talk to journalists. You've told them you're not going to write a book, as I just have, and I hope you enjoyed it, by the way, because it's risky behavior on my part. But you have a secrecy agreement, and at the same time, you have an oath to defend the Constitution. And the secret that you're asked to protect is that the government is violating that Constitution and the rights of people around the world.
Do you believe in the term deep state?
So this term has unfortunately been poisoned over the last few years to mean so many different things that it's hard to use it seriously. The deep state is a real thing, and what traditionally we in the intelligence services use it to refer to are the career officials in government who are not political appointees, right? You have one government, and then there's an election, and you have another government, and all of these senior officials who are appointed by this government, all of them who are put in these political positions, are wiped away each time, and you've got a fresh slate. But what about the people who are just one step lower, and the people who are one step lower, and eventually the whole of government, right? But the ones that are high enough in that permanent structure of government are the ones that know where all the skeletons are. They know the powers, they know the permissions, they know the restrictions, and they know the responsibilities. And more than anything else, they know how to scare the hell out of these new guys who get parachuted in after every election. And so the first weeks of any no government, what these guys do is they tend to manipulate these newcomers who often aren't career officials, but are in the US system, donors or people who are just trusted by those who were recently elected. And they say, oh, this is how it works. These are the rules. This is how it should be. You need to worry about this. You need to do that. And that's actually what we want. We want them to be able to transmit their knowledge to those who are elected to represent the government. But when you have secret agencies, these newcomers have no ability to question what they're being told. They have no public record. They have no books to reference. They have no public reporting to tell them what is and is not correct. And so collectively, what we see from this career body of government is really a constant, unending pressure to expand the power of intelligence services. And this is what has unfortunately changed intelligence services the world around, because this dynamic exists not just in the United States, but everywhere, where we no longer have intelligence services. We have a combined body that does intelligence, yes, which is useful in many cases, but it's also a counterterrorism service. It's also a propaganda service. It's also a covert action service. And it's doing all of these things that are actually fundamentally in conflict with intelligence gathering. A prime example that could not be more relevant today, of course, is cybersecurity. You have the agency that is in charge of hacking people, that is also in charge of protecting people from being hacked. And so inevitably, one of the big disasters we've had in the United States, but we also see this replicated in our partners, is that laws are never improved to limit what the government can do in terms of hacking. The laws never really restrict how long the government can be aware of crucial flaws in critical infrastructure. I'm talking about the software that keeps the dams closed and the stoplights on. And so they keep these open for years and years and years because they go, well, if we know about it, we can use this to gather intelligence on other countries. We can hack into their systems. We can spy on them. But these other countries can find the same hole because we never fixed it. Or when we use it to sneak into their country, they can follow us back home through it and then use it to attack us. And the problem increasingly is our adversaries are countries that are not as developed. They're countries that are not as connected. We could hack North Korea to the full extent of our capability every day for the next 10 years, and it would not do as much damage to them as 10 small attacks launched by them would do to us, because technology is central to our societies, whereas it is secondary to theirs.
One of the points or the stories you share in the book is that you read from time to time the Constitution during your shifts with the NSA on Hawaii. And if you wanted to provoke your colleagues, you even handed over copies to them as a small gift to say what a wonderful Constitution. You say you can recite the preamble of the Constitution. Is that true?
It is. I'm not going to do it here on camera, but the Fourth Amendment is
Ed,
the one that I look at more frequently, which is the right of the people to be secure in their persons, papers, and effects, shall not be subject to unreasonable search or seizure, but upon probable cause, or give an oath or affirmation to a court, or no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause. And what this means, right, is that we have a fundamental right in the United States, which is actually, it's interesting how it's structured. Most of our rights in the United States are actually derived from prohibitions on what the government can do, that it can legislate at all. Even if Congress, or the Parliament in your circumstance, wants to pass, even what there is a majority to say we can pass, they cannot pass a law that does this, that infringes on this right. And when you look at the Bill of Rights, when you look in this constitutional context, the whole of the first 10 essential rights that are guaranteed, which we call the Bill of Rights, it's interesting that fully half of them are actually designed explicitly by the people who created the government to make the work of government harder. And this is something that today is very surprising, because all of these intelligence officials, all of these government parties are saying, well, we need the work of law enforcement to be more efficient. We want intelligence services to be more efficient. And yet the documents that created our countries are entirely designed intentionally to make the government less efficient, because the less the government does, the freer that the people are. And it is this zone that I think we've forgotten. When we say privacy today, privacy is so overburdened a word that people forget its meaning. Where we go, privacy is about data. Privacy is about your home. It's about a resistance from search, like we're talking about. But privacy is so much more. Think about the term private property. Privacy is the right to the self. It's to have something for you. It's to say that you belong to yourself rather than to society. And if society wants to interfere with you, if a law is to be applied to you, society has to overcome that right of yours. They have to go to a court and establish that there is evidence that you represent such a harm, a threat to society, that it is reasonable to violate. But even here, even though privacy is what gives the right of speech meaning, the freedom of the press meaning, freedom of religion meaning, even if you don't believe in God, even if you don't have something to say, even if you're not a reporter or you don't read, these rights matter, because you cannot give them up individually without harming them for others who do need them, because it is both an individual and collective right. And if we create a society, a structure, which Germans know far better than most people in the world, that if you create a society where they say, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear, what that does is it shifts that burden from the state having to justify its intrusions into the public rights, into the public at every individual moment, in every individual life, having to justify why it needs a right, why it deserves a right, and that it is no longer a right. It is a permission that is being evaluated each time. We have to preserve today, not just against governments, but against corporations, this space called privacy, which simply defines the entirety of the domain into which corporations and governments are not meant to rule supreme. And this is why we see so many companies today going, oh, privacy doesn't matter, or people don't care about privacy. The reality is, and I've spoken on stage after stage in every country to every age group, people care about privacy more than they have almost any other time, because now they see the violations of it. When it was your neighbor who knew something about you, you knew your neighbor. Now the people who know something about you are not related to you. You don't control them. You have no influence over what they do with this material. And it's beginning to change our lives. When you look into China, when you look into Russia, when you look into Iran, when you look into the rise of authoritarian states, even in places that shouldn't be authoritarian like Australia, where they're beginning to pass mandatory surveillance laws, mandatory metadata retention laws, they call metadata simply meaning activity records. These are private records of private lives and trying to create a secret history of your life. These things are being used for investigations into journalists. These are being used in places like China to decide who can ride a train, who can board a plane, who gets a job and who doesn't, who gets a loan and who doesn't, who goes to school and who doesn't. And in increasingly automated and complex societies, the only way we can prevent this from coming here is not through data protection laws, as well-intentioned as they are, but through data collection laws. We have to prohibit the collection and amassment of this data in the first place, because otherwise what we have constructed are databases of ruin that have enough information in them to destroy any one of us, and simply trusting a company to follow the law or to uphold the ethics that we hope they will, or a government, even the government you trust the least, not to steal that information and use it against us.
Ed, you must be aware that you have a room full of Germans who know nothing about the American Constitution. Are you sure you're not going to recite the preamble for us?
I promise, because if I get a word wrong, it will haunt me forever.
Well, I would say this is a true patriot. This is nothing you have to be ashamed of, but okay, that's your choice. Do you remember this?
I can't see it, actually. My camera is very... the Rubiks Cube. Yes, the Rubiks Cube.
Yes, you want to share the story, what that cube means for the NSA affair?
Okay. So for all of you in the audience who are less familiar with my story, some of you probably already know this, know where it's going. But put yourself in my position. You have discovered, after very many years of being the most loyal part of the government machine, that the government is in fact betraying the loyalty of its own citizens. You know that you're one of the few people in the country who can both access the information about this, and you have the technical authorities to retrieve it from the system, and you can show this as evidence to journalists who could then tell the public about it if they believe the public needs to know. How do you do it? This is one of the most secure facilities that I'm working in on the planet. It is a old aircraft construction facility from World War II that was buried into the side of a hill in Hawaii, right? So if it was bombed, it would survive. And there's a very, very long tunnel into it, from which there are no exits, but going all the way down the tunnel. That has guards and metal detectors and what they call man traps, which are these kind of revolving gates where you go in one and the door behind you is locked and the door in front of you isn't released until everything checks out. So I had begun my career at a very humble level. I was not a technologist at all, really, but a security guard with a few technical skills where they let me work on some technological things. But because I had worked as a security guard, I understood the sort of psychology of all these poor young guys who themselves were standing there in the middle of the night with no one walking by. And the reality is every security guard on the planet is bored all the time. So I've always liked the Rubiks Cube, and what I do is I begin carrying one into and out of the office. Everyone is used to me carrying the Rubiks Cube, and it's an interesting thing. Everyone tries to talk to me, start a conversation about it. They joke about how as they were kids, they couldn't solve it, so they'd take the stickers off and then try to put them on the other side to make it correct. And then I gave Rubik's Cubes to everyone in my office as Christmas presents. And now the whole facility sees these Rubik's Cubes going back and forth. It's a normal thing. And it raises no suspicion. So now, as I go through this facility, and I have micro SD cards. They're data storage devices that are tiny. They're about the size of just the tip of a pinky finger. In some Rubik's Cubes, you can actually pull a cube off, or you can pull a little face off of it, and you can put this inside it just with a little bit of chewing gum or something, and it won't rattle, it won't make any noise, it won't fall off, and you can carry it inside a Rubik's Cube, inside and outside of the building, and no one will ever be the wiser. This is not the only way I did this, but when I was first very nervous, I had no confidence in this, it was what I did. Later on, I convinced myself this was actually a bad idea. Because even though I could hand this to the guard and they could look at it and we could laugh and have a conversation, if someone had put it through an X-ray machine, I would have been in trouble. We didn't have an X-ray machine at Hawaii, so I was comfortable that it wouldn't be a problem. But later on, I began just putting it in my socks. I put it in my cheek in case I needed to swallow it. And finally, after I'd done this many times, I just put it in my back pocket. Because if someone happened to find it, it was encrypted. And I just say, oh, I forgot about it.
You say that you read tons of indictments against other whistleblowers, but also traitors. Did you ever consider that the US General Attorney would impose the death penalty?
The sad thing is, under the laws that I've been charged with, we don't see the death penalty as likely. But the United States government, both under Barack Obama and even more so under Donald Trump, has been increasingly aggressive against the sources of journalists. Reality Winner, which is the name of a young woman in the United States, who took from the NSA, after I came forward, a single document that was about the NSA's belief that the Russian intelligence services had targeted electoral infrastructure in the United States, right? So she took a single document and she gave it to journalists about the idea that Russian intelligence services could be interfering in the US election at a time when the most important story in the US public discussion was Russian interference in the US election. There is no question amongst any journalists that this was in the public interest to know. There's no question that she revealed this document out of just a belief that the public needed to know about this. She didn't make money off of this. This didn't advance her career. The journalists who received it from her didn't even know her name. She was sentenced to 63 months in prison for a single document, more than 5 years. The government, although the number is not accurate, accuses me of having taken 1.5 million documents, the maximum penalty for which is 10 years per document. I would say, even if they say they're not going to electrocute me or shoot me or hang me, is there a difference between putting a person who revealed information not to foreign governments, not for their own personal benefit, but only to the public and only through journalists, to the detriment of themselves, something that causes consequences for them but not benefits? Should they be killed, whether it's through a bullet or whether it's through a cage? I would argue no. Especially in the United States when there is no fair trial to be guaranteed. Let me define fair trial just quickly, because I know there's some people who will protest that that's not the case. The laws under which I've been charged in the United States are a special kind of law. They're a very unusual law in the United States. It's called a strict liability crime. A strict liability crime means the jury is forbidden from hearing why you did what you did. They are forbidden from discussing whether it was good or whether it was bad. They are forbidden from considering your motivations in any way, and you are not allowed to even mention them in court. The only thing the jury is allowed to hear is the arguments as to whether the information was provided to someone who was not authorized to receive it. If you gave this information to journalists, regardless of whether the government was breaking the law or not, regardless of whether these illegal activities were stopped afterwards, regardless if reforms came, regardless if it was good or bad for society, the jury cannot consider it. I would argue, when we're talking about crimes by the government being the impetus for revealing information to journalists, you cannot have a fair trial if the jury cannot consider the question of was the disclosure justified or unjustified.
Have you been afraid at the beginning when you stranded in Moscow that a CIA team or an FBI team would hunt you down, either try to assassinate you or to render you?
Well, you should probably hide the
Hey,
URL
buddy.
on
Hey,
top of
buddy.
the-
You're not part of the
you know?
conversation.
Thank you, Renee. Could you drop the call for us? It's a
Yeah.
good point. Thanks, but everybody else on the call is on there. And for the
Well,
people
well,
running
ladies
the
and
tech
gentlemen,
in the
that was
room,
Renee, obviously.
they were saying, could you please hide the URL from the top? Because otherwise anyone can join. Thanks again, Renee. Yeah, when we look at when I came forward, of course, the U.S. government considered me basically the biggest criminal in the country, and it was crazy because the crime that they were accusing me of is essentially aiding and abetting an act of journalism. People forget, but they canceled my passport. They grounded the presidential aircraft of the president of Bolivia, which has diplomatic immunity. And as far as I'm aware, this is completely unprecedented in the history of international relations, on the mere rumor that I was on board en route to Latin America to seek asylum. So yes, I very much felt that I was surviving in a position of threat. I was very careful when I went outside. I was worried about who was going to follow me home, if it was going to be dangerous. And I was very much worried about the threats to my family. All these years later, the accusations that were leveled against me about all these harms that were caused, all of these dangers that were going to be produced because this information was being published at all, they haven't borne out. Now, after more than 6 years of investigation, the government of the United States, and as far as I understand, every other country in the world, no one has shown any evidence at all of a single person coming to harm as a result of this journalism. And so I think this has actually reduced the levels of threat that I face from day-to-day life. If somebody pushes me in front of a bus, or they push me, off a building, or they just shoot me, or they kidnap me and, take me to Guantanamo, they may silence me, but they've also proven my point.
There have been rumors from day one on to discredit you as a Russian agent. Did the Russians ever try to recruit you?
Yeah, and this is actually, for those who are interested in this, it's in the book. When I first landed...
Well, this was some advertisement here. well, fair enough.
Thank you. But really, yeah, for those who are interested, this is an entire chapter in the book. When I was leaving Hong Kong and I was en route to Latin America, of course, my government canceled my passport, which meant that when I landed in Russia, I couldn't leave. I go to passport control, and this Russian guy picks up the phone. I notice it's taking longer than everyone else. And he goes, there is problem with passport. And I go, oh, God, here it goes. And unusually, because I had some training for the CIA on what to expect if you have trouble in airports and situations like this, I wasn't taken to a security area, which was very unusual. I was taken to a business lounge. And in this business lounge are all these officials in, black suits. And there's this one guy with white hair, and, there's the boss. And he made what in the CIA we call a cold pitch. This is just basically a direct attempt to see if someone is interested in cooperating. Now, this is very unusual because normally these kind of approaches are only made in secret. And I had a witness with me, Sarah Harrison, who was on the flight, who I refused to be separated from. So already, this woman who's been introduced as my legal advisor and a journalist has them a little careful, a little nervous, because they've never had to do it this way before. And they say, you know, do you have some information? Do you want to help us? Do you want to cooperate with us? And I say, no, I'm not interested in that, because I'm thinking there's a tape recorder under the desk. I have no information with me. I destroyed my copy of the archive before I left Hong Kong because I knew I was going to have to go through many countries. And even if you guys are skeptical of me, even if you doubt, you know, that I am an American patriot and I'm not working against my country, even if you think, you know, I'm some kind of evil spy, put yourself in that position and imagine you have in your head all of the secrets from everything there. You have the password that unlocks all of these intelligence programs. And any one of these countries have to do in order to get it is to torture you. That's a very dangerous position to be in. So the only way to be safe was not to have it. And I could immediately say, I know what these meetings are like. And this is not going to be that kind of meeting. I'm not interested in cooperation. I'm not going to share any information. And if you don't believe me, I don't have anything. Here's my bag. Search it, please. And immediately this official is like, oh, no, no, we would never do that. We only want to help you. We only want to help you.
Well, it's Russia.
And I say, no, thanks. We'll be all right on our own. And he says, you know, be sure you don't regret it. And so this
Again,
is
it's Russia.
for intelligence services. This is the way it always is. But the main thing is you have to shut these down immediately, and you have to do them promptly, because even if you ultimately say, no, I'm not going to cooperate, if they can catch you on tape considering it, negotiating, they can destroy your reputation. They can make you into a tool. And that's what my training told me to do, was just stop it right there.
So this one cold pitch, nothing else?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is the thing. When you look at, you know, people are skeptical about this. They go, oh, the Russian government wouldn't do this. I was trapped in that airport for 40 days, not 40 minutes. And the reason I was trapped there, the reason you know this is true, is because I wasn't being cooperative. If I had cooperated, if I said, yeah, sure, I'll help you. If you say, you know, let's make some deal. Let's say, oh, I'm not a total traitor, but I'll tell you this, that, or the other. They would have driven me out of the airport in a limousine. I would be living in a palace right now. There would be parades. I'd have a statue in Red Square. I'd be a hero of Russia. But you have to realize that at the moment these guys had to make the decision about whether to go after me or not, there's 4,000 journalists waiting downstairs in the airport. So if they take any sort of physical threat against me, I can tell them. And if I show up with bruises on my face, it's an even better story. And, you know, I think they just didn't know what to do. And they realized that because the United States government was itself already in the hot seat, they were already damaging their reputation by treating a whistleblower as if they were a terrorist. The only thing the Russian government had to do to end up looking like the good guys is to do nothing. The more they tried to do strange things, the more they tried to do intelligence operations, the more risks that they would face, because I was literally the most famous person in the world at that moment for not being cooperative with intelligence services. Like, a lot of people are skeptical, but when you think about it in that context, it's obvious they were as afraid of me as I was of them.
Let's speak a little bit about personal questions. I know that's not your most famous territory, but there's no free lunch. So, is it true that you've never been drunk in your entire life?
Yeah. I don't like the taste of alcohol. This is something that, you know, people think I have like a religious objection or like a philosophical objection. When I was younger, I had friends who tried to get me to drink, and every time I tried, I was like, oh, God, it's just, For me, I don't enjoy it.
You know they have
And a
great
lot of
vodka
my
over there, huh?
friends- Sorry, say again?
You know they have great vodka over there?
I'm sure they do, and they can have as much of it as they'd like. But for me, honestly, particularly now in my life, it's probably better if I'm in control of my own decision making.
I remember that you've been pretty active in martial arts. I think you had a black belt in Kung Fu in Maryland, back home. Do you still practice?
I don't have a black belt. In the martial arts that I did, there was no belt system. You'd either been going there longer than the person beside you, or you hadn't. There was no ranking. It was just everyone knew the skills of the person next to them, so it was sort of more of a personal thing. I'm not competitive, and I'm not interested in competing. It's just something that I did for health and enjoyment. I haven't had much chance to do that today because I live in a 2-bedroom apartment, and I don't, as you might be able to tell, hang out at the gym. But maybe someday, maybe when I have more time, I'll try once again.
You share the story that if you once at school back home in Maryland, you had to conduct an intelligence quotient test, an IQ, but you don't share the results with us. You want to do it here?
No, so the thing is, my father is very proud of me, and he told some newspaper, it might have been in Germany some years ago, the results of these tests, because of course I was being attacked in the media all the time, and they say, you know, I don't know anything, and he's just a low-level guy, he's a technologist, he doesn't understand these big matters of state, and my father was furious. He's like, no, he's such a bright boy, you don't understand. And, you know, I love my father. Everyone understands what it's got to be like for a parent in that situation. But honestly, I don't want to be judged by a number. And I don't think any of us should be scored and have that determine how much we are worth. I would rather that we have a conversation, that you listen to me and you decide, based on what you hear, if I'm the kind of person that you feel is worth listening to or not.
Well, so just for the protocol, let me fill in the gap here. It's 145, correct?
I will neither confirm nor deny, but I'm sure my father would be very happy to hear.
That's in true intelligence training, isn't it? You also reveal in the book that you have epilepsy. How do you deal with that in such an environment as you're living in right now?
So it's actually an interesting story. Epilepsy is a poorly understood condition. It's provoked by a number of different circumstances. My mother suffered from epilepsy. But only when she was older, actually at about the same age, I began to show symptoms. And she had never had them in her youth. She had gone through her whole life. None of us knew she was epileptic. But she had unexplained falls. She was always clumsy. And we never realized it, but what was actually happening was she was having very brief lapses of consciousness from very small seizures. And eventually it caused a very serious problem for her in her office. And they took her to the hospital and they said, you're having seizures. And she knew she was epileptic then. They medicated her and she had a very serious period where for some weeks she had profound seizures and then they disappeared and she never had another seizure again. My story is actually very similar. I was on the phone with a security official from my company talking about some meeting or passing clearances to a building for a meeting that I needed to have. And suddenly I was struck with the seizure and I couldn't use the phone. I couldn't use all of these things. I didn't even realize what was happening until afterwards, but it was a terrible, terrible feeling. And it was only after that and recurring lots of diagnosis and tests that they said that you are epileptic as well, even though the doctors swear that epilepsy is not a hereditary condition. I don't know whether they said this to make me feel better or whether because it's actually true, but that's what I was told. But the same thing happened. I went on medication, and it was very difficult for me because the medication made me feel slow. I couldn't speak as well. I couldn't think as quickly. I was always dizzy. But after some weeks and months on this medication, I stabilized and I didn't have as many problems. And then I have not had another seizure since.
Share a little bit how your life is in Moscow. I learned that you once in a while go to Burger King.
Yeah. I was at Burger King just a few days ago, in fact. Burger King was almost the entirety of my diet when I was trapped in that airport for so long. Yeah, I live a pretty normal life, which is to say it's actually not so interesting on the day-to-day. I'm a technologist, so the majority of my time is spent indoors on computers, either talking at events like yours or working at the Freedom of the Press Foundation at the United States, or helping where I can in discussions with the American Civil Liberties Union. I have board meetings, I have walks in the park with my wife, I go out to movies, I go out to restaurants. It's an ordinary life. I'm always a little bit worried that people will recognize me, not today because I think I'll be in some danger, but just because as a privacy advocate, I would rather be left alone. But other than that, it's strange that because my life has been mediated by a screen, because I spend so much time looking at a computer, my life doesn't change very much, whether I'm living in Maryland or New York or Geneva or Tokyo or Moscow. The thing that matters the most to me is connection. It's communication. And technology means that no matter where I am exiled, so long as I can reach the internet, I can be heard.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to open up the conversation in a couple of moments. So if you have a question you want to ask Edward Snowden, this is a pretty unique opportunity for you. Please give me in a moment a signal, and we have two microphones on the left and on the right hand of the auditorium. But before we do that, Ed, you've been an active hacker when you were young. Are you still out there from time to time at night?
No. When you say active hacker, relative to the average person on the street, sure, but relative to people who actually really know what they're doing, I'm not a specialist. I'm not a developer. I'm not a coder. And I wouldn't say I'm a hacker. What I would say is that hacking as an activity is much more broad than people who do this all the time, and that's their specialty. What does hacking mean? Right? And when people think about hackers, they think about people and computers. Maybe they think about criminals. They think about breaking into computers. They think about destroying security processes. That's not actually what hacking is. That's one application of hacking. I would define hacking as understanding the way the rules actually work in a system better than the people who created that system or the people who manage that system. You can hack a legal system. You can hack a social system. You can hack a school system. You can hack any set of rules. You can hack the way people play a game. Hacking is discovering the distance between our assumptions about how a system works and how it actually works. Hacking is not breaking the rules. Hacking is showing how someone misunderstood how the rules actually function.
So Ed, I would like to take a couple of questions from the auditorium, and please, here in the first row. And please introduce yourself and please make it short.
Lutz Brechelt, Freie Universität Berlin.
A scientist from the Free University.
In the aftermath of your disclosures and when looking at the things that developed, what have you learned? What are your conclusions when you look at Western democracies and how their societies and political systems work? How do they work and what works and what doesn't?
Wow, that's a big question. Well, they are closing the facility in 3 hours, so please, short answer, Ed.
No, it's a great question. It is a little big for me to take quickly, but I think what I've realized for myself is something that's very obvious to perhaps professors and people who have much more experience both in politics and life than myself, which is famously the corrupting influence of power. What I think we have seen in my country and throughout the Western world in the wake of September 11th is a moment of fear, a moment of shared national, in my case, and international trauma more broadly, made political bodies worry that they didn't have enough power. And so what they began was a race, both internally in their own countries, and relatively, compared to all of the other countries in the world, to expand their power to the most maximalist extent. And this is fundamentally antithetical to liberty, to the idea of a free society. Because again, the measure of power that citizens have, the measure of power that society has, that the public broadly has, is precisely equal to that government or that power which governments do not hold, which companies do not hold. This is sort of the civil space. And what, of course, we've seen in the last 20 years as we entered this period of unending wars is the privileges of government have expanded at a rate that's very much matched by the reduction of privileges held by general people. This pressure, typically in past periods, we might like to think could eventually recede. It could be reformed, right? We could see emergency laws halt rather than continue in perpetuity as we see in places, for example, like France. But as these powers today are being expanded by government, we see something new, which is that businesses, companies, corporations are working in concert with government, and together they're creating a kind of ratchet. They're using technology to make sure every time they gain a new power, it is written not just into our laws, but into our systems, such that the ratchet only goes one way. Their privileges can go up and up and up, but we cannot reclaim our freedoms once they're lost. And so government and corporations now have a strategy that basically says either for companies to improve the user experience, they need all of these new capabilities, they need all of these authorities, or for governments, because the danger of terrorism, because of the threats to national security, they need these additional capabilities. But what I ask you is when we look at the wake of the disclosures of 2013, my government, under Barack Obama, appointed 2 independent commissions to study the question of were these mass surveillance programs, particularly the first of which that I revealed, which was the mass collection of phone records of everyone in the country and around the world that they could get, regardless of whether you were a criminal or not. You would be the most innocent person, they got your records all the same. And despite more than 10 years of operation in secret, the government itself, with full access to classified information, said this program never stopped a single terrorist attack. They said it never even made a concrete difference in a single counterterrorism investigation. And in fact, the only place it made any difference at all was the case of a cab driver, taxi driver, in California, sending $8,500 to his clan in Somalia, which happened to be connected to terrorism. That's it. The loss of our rights, 10 years of operation, billions of dollars spent to catch a cab driver spending money. And they said even in that case, they could have gotten him through traditional means, because once they had enough information to look him up in the database, to type in his name, to type in his phone number, his email address, they could have gone to a court and gotten a warrant. So I ask you, if these programs are not effective in protecting public safety, if they are not about public safety, what are they about? And it's not about public safety, it's about power. It's about traditional intelligence gathering, which is a conversation the government doesn't want to have because it's easier to disagree. It's easier to have a more complex conversation. It's about power, diplomatic manipulation, economic espionage, and social influence, right? And do we want to sacrifice the freedoms that generations of our ancestors fought and died to achieve in order to have a government that is more powerful? Perhaps there are some who say, yes, we should. But there is one bedrock principle that I will not abandon, and that's if we go in that direction, it must be the public's decision, not a few intelligence officials deciding for us behind closed doors.
Okay, I see two more hands. One gentleman over there in the back. And we'll take another one afterwards in the left back, please. Yeah. The hand is gone. All right, so it's the lady here in the middle. Just a second, Ed, we're handing over the mic. Please introduce yourself.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Lea Wagner, and I'm a student of economics and IT. And my question is, what do you think concretely, what can an individual do, or how can we contribute to creating a safe, but at the same time free society in the age of digitalization?
The first thing is to care. And this is actually, it sounds simple, but we have to do it broadly. We have to care enough to have uncomfortable conversations with our friends, with our loved ones, with people that we disagree with. And we have to persuade them that these things matter. And I think it's difficult for people because, again, they don't have a good conception of privacy, of what it means. There has been some polling done that says when you describe what we're discussing as privacy, people understand it less well than if you say the conversation is about liberty. But increasingly they are the same thing. When we talk about data, when we talk about data collection, when we talk about the exploitation of data, when we talk about the abuse of data, it all sounds very abstract to the non-expert, to the average person. They go, oh, it's about, selling me shoes. They don't think about the Chinese model. They don't think about the future because they can't see it. And this abstraction is where most of this becomes invisible. But I think data today has a living quality to it. Everywhere you go, everything you do, every conversation that you have, everything you buy, everything that you read is producing records. The history of your phone is in a real way the history of your intellectual life. When we talk about data, what we're talking about is the memories that you cherish the most, the people that you care about the most, the secrets that embarrass you the most, and the ideas that you have developed that belong only to you, that you haven't yet developed enough confidence in to share. Our data is in a real way us. And what is being exploited is not data, it is people. What we are seeing is the exploitation of human lives. What we are seeing is our generations pollution problem. Our phones are spewing signals into the air at every moment that we cannot see, but that do harm us. And it is the very invisibility of this, and it is the knowing concealment of this information that is leading to the construction of what I describe in the book as our permanent records. There are systems, both governmental and commercial, whose full and total aim is the construction of perfect records of private lives. They are using it today to make money. They are using it to change behaviors, to shape votes. And in some cases, unfortunately, but in a very real case, they are using it to end lives. But as much as our data says about us, as many stories as our records tell about us, they are only a part of us. Someone can have the whole of your phone conversations. Someone can have the entirety of the transcripts of every conversation you've had in your life. And they do not have your soul. One of the things that I learned in mass surveillance is that you can use these records to predict behavior in many cases. You can tell the route someone's going to use to take to work. You can tell who they're likely to call after they experience an emergency situation. But that doesn't mean that you understand who they are. That doesn't even mean that you have properly identified this person. Records and devices are unreliable because the people that are producing them are ourselves unreliable. We are always changing. We are imperfect. We are, again, unconfident. And your life can change tomorrow, right? One of the big conversations that, a conflict between me and a famous whistleblower in my country, Daniel Ellsberg, he's a very dear friend of mine and we're close.
Pentagon Papers.
Yes. Should you call people heroes? He says you should. I say you shouldn't. The reason why is when you say this person's a hero, you're saying they're different than you are. They're saying they did something that you could not do. And that excuses us from a sense of responsibility because the reality is you pass decisions every day where you can make a heroic choice. There aren't heroic people. There are heroic choices. And you are never more than one decision away from making one yourself. You can change, we can change, but so long as we retain our power.
We have time for one more question. I saw the hand in the back over there. Okay. Please introduce yourself and please cut it short.
I'll try. Hi, my name's Annie Makhashvili. I'm also a researcher at the Free University. How would you evaluate the state of digital activism in Russia, and are you involved in any ways in fighting for digital rights and privacy in Russia? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad you asked. First off, I like this university. I ask a lot of good questions. But the matter on Russia, I actually maintain very little connection to Russian civil society, both because if everyone is spying on me, and the Russian government certainly is, being in communication with me would expose them to the same kind of spying and surveillance. The second thing is, of course, publicly, I have opposed the Russian government's surveillance policies. I think I displayed some of it before. But when we talk about, for example, the way the Russian government is trying to gain access to cryptographic keys to be able to see private messages sent over popular messengers, this is something that should not be allowed. And the thing here is people focus on the Russian angle of this because, of course, there is such a popular and well-founded distrust of how the Russian government will use or rather abuse those capabilities. But we need to remember this is not about Russia. This is a global problem. Yes, we need to do what we can to resist it in authoritarian states, but this is a worldwide problem. And the only way that you can prevent the Russian government from gaining access to these capabilities is to forbid the American government from gaining access to them, to forbid the German and the French and the British and the Australian and every government from having access to them. Because if not, these governments will go, well, these companies cooperate with this government and that government and that government, so they must cooperate with us. We have courts too. We can stamp any warrant we want. You know, Kim Jong-un is sitting in North Korea right now. He's going, I've got courts, so I can give you any paperwork you want. Law is an essential protection, and we want it to be as strong as possible. But we need to remember that there are circumstances where institutions and processes fail. And so what we need to do now that we have an advanced understanding of math and science, and especially technology, we need to institute additional safeguards. That means we do not only express our values and encode them in law, letters on the page, but we also need to encode our values into our systems, into our technology, so that we do not just express a right in writing to people in our country, but we guarantee those rights by baking them into global technology that works for everyone around the world, no matter what country they live in.
How disappointed are you? How disappointed are you with the German Chancellor Angela Merkel that she refused to offer you asylum at?
How badly do you want to make a headline, Mr. Snowden?
Well, go ahead.
Look, I think it's better to ask the German public this question than it is to ask me. It's okay for people to have differing opinions about what I did. It's okay for people to disagree about whether I'm a good or bad guy. These disagreements are actually important. They're useful for democracy because our disagreements produce better outcomes. It is that conversation, it is that argument that allows us to distance the true from the false, the fact from the feeling. And we live in a time, unfortunately, where feelings have become so much more important than facts. If there is anything that I am disappointed by, it is the fact that we have seen governments in advanced countries for years now criticizing the theoretical risks of journalism in a free society. The fact that publishing this story or that story could be risky. Of course, the work of a free press in an open society is going to be risky. All freedom is risky. If you have a capability, if you have a freedom, and you give it to enough people, someone inevitably will abuse that because it's giving them power. And power can be used for good or bad. But we accept that people will always be able to abuse their capability. You can't stop someone from driving a car into a crowd. You can't stop someone from picking up a hammer and hitting someone in the head with it. What you can do is you can build a resilient society that can punish criminals, that can hold them to the account of our laws, that can care for the victims, that can help us heal and help us progress, that can help us build a better and stronger society, because we recognize that criminals are not equivalent to our state. Terrorists are not an existential threat, and they never will be. Because no matter how successful they are, there are few of them. And their arguments are not persuasive, and they do not have a movement that is based on values that can last the way our societies are. If we treat them as criminals, rather than militaries, we can have societies that are both safe and free. If we recognize that the press is not a threat to government, it is not a threat to democracy, but rather it is the guarantor of it. Because in a democracy, your vote is only meaningful, consent is only meaningful if it is informed. And yes, it's going to make things uncomfortable for governments. And yes, it is going to have risks. And yes, the press can and should work to reduce those risks as much as it possibly can as it goes about its work. But it is the press's role in a free society to make government uncomfortable. And if the government wants to say the work of journalism is dangerous, if it wants to say the things that a whistleblower says are dangerous or have caused harm, I would hope that in at least 6 years, they could show us evidence for it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, you remember Daniel Ellsberg and the hero. Edward Snowden, thank you so much for taking the time and talking with us. We wish you all the best for the future. Stay healthy, stay strong, and stay safe. Hope to talk to you soon, and please, take care. Meine Damen und Herren.
Wait. I have to stop you.
Hey!
Thank you.
We're almost done here.
You gave me such a warm blessing for health and all of these things. The one thing that I will ask you, you told me to say safe, and thank you. You know, it means a lot to my family. But please, don't tell me to stay safe. I won't tell you to stay safe. We have done that for 20 years, and it has left us worse off. Ladies and gentlemen, please don't stay safe. Stay free.
Meine Damen und Herren, vielen Dank, dass Sie heute bei uns waren. Edward Snowdens Autobiografie heißt Permanent Record, ist im S. Fischer Verlag erschienen. Die Zeit und der Fischer Verlag bedanken sich ganz herzlich, dass Sie heute hier waren. Ich hoffe, Sie haben den Abend genossen. Kommen Sie gut nach Hause und bleiben Sie uns gewogen.